A young woman from France set off to visit her relatives in Britain for Christmas, but along the way, she vanished without a trace. Police immediately launched a large-scale search, and the case quickly made headlines in both countries. Before long, investigators pieced together a chain of clues that brought them closer to the truth, but what they uncovered was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Céline Fegard was born on May 23, 1976, in the French town of Besançon. It was a quiet and peaceful place, not far from the Swiss border. Céline grew up in a loving family with her parents, 2 brothers, and a sister. Her dad was a farmer, so she and her siblings spent a lot of time outside, helping him keep the farm running. At school, Céline was active in sports and had many friends. When she was 14, her parents took her to nearby Britain, and she absolutely loved it. From that point on, she started thinking about moving there someday. She decided to pursue an education that would allow her to work in the hotel business, inspired by her cousin, who was a hotel manager in the UK. After finishing school, Céline enrolled in a local university to study accounting. She also continued visiting her cousin in England whenever she could. One summer, he helped her get a job at a hotel, and she spent a few months working there before returning home. At the end of 1995, when Céline was 19, she decided to travel to Britain again for Christmas. At that time of year, public trains in France were experiencing disruptions, so her parents asked a family friend, a truck driver, for help. He was delivering cargo to England and agreed to give her a ride to a town called Folkestone. From there, Céline planned to travel to Fordingbridge, a town about 150 miles or 250 kilometers away, where her cousin lived. On December 18, Céline left home, planning to reach her cousin's hotel by that evening. Her parents were expecting a call from her to let them know she had arrived safely. But, as the evening stretched on, there was no word from Céline. She didn't have a mobile phone, so all her family could do was just wait and hope she would make it to the hotel eventually. Later that night, they finally got a call, but it wasn't Céline. It was her cousin. He told them she still hadn't arrived and asked if something had changed in her plans. Céline's parents grew even more worried and, with no other options, decided to contact the police. French authorities quickly reached out to their British colleagues, who immediately launched a search for the missing woman. Their first step was to speak with Céline's parents, who traveled to England to assist in the investigation. They told them about a family friend, a truck driver, who had agreed to give Céline a ride to Britain. The police tracked him down, and he confirmed that he had dropped her off in Folkestone. After that, he had to head in a different direction. While they were at the truck stop, the driver met another French trucker who was heading to a town called Newbury, about an hour's drive from Céline's cousin's hotel. This second driver agreed to give Céline a lift, and investigators managed to locate him as well. He told the police he had dropped Céline off at a truck stop in Newbury. She had tried using a payphone there to call her cousin and ask him to pick her up, but for some reason, she couldn't get through. By that time, it was already 4:30 p.m. The driver told Céline she could take a train to her cousin's town, but there was a problem. The nearest station was a few dozen miles away, and he couldn't take her there since he had to deliver his cargo in a different direction. He still wanted to help, so he started asking other truckers in the parking lot if anyone could give Céline a ride. The first driver he asked turned him down, saying he was planning to rest before his next trip. But the second trucker agreed. He said he was heading to Salisbury, just about a 30-minute drive from Céline's cousin's town. He even mentioned she could probably catch an 8 p.m. bus from there. With no other options left, Céline went with the third driver, and that's where her trail disappeared. Detectives tried to track this man down, but they didn't have enough solid information to identify him. The second driver who had handed her over couldn't recall the license plate number and only remembered that the truck was a white Mercedes. He also provided a description of the man. He was around 35 years old, had short blonde hair, and a beard. The second driver also mentioned that something about this man struck him as suspicious. There was something unsettling about his behavior, but he still let Céline go with him because, at that point, she simply had no other choice. Police began to suspect that the third driver might have been involved in Céline's disappearance. Using the witness's description, they created a composite sketch and shared it with the local media. As for the first two drivers, investigators thoroughly checked their alibis and found solid evidence proving they had been in other locations at the time. Detectives soon uncovered a troubling detail that made them even more suspicious of the third driver. Remember how he told Celine she could catch an evening bus to her cousin's town from Salisbury? Well, it turned out that no such bus existed. Investigators wasted no time getting the word out about Celine's disappearance. They shared her story, along with the suspect's composite sketch, through newspapers and TV. The case quickly grabbed national attention in both Britain and France. It was just days before Christmas, and the disappearance of a young woman during the holiday season struck a chord with the public. On top of that, there were fears that Celine might have fallen victim to a serial killer. Over the past 2 years, several young women had been murdered in the same area. Police believed these cases were linked to a single perpetrator, and now they were worried Celine's disappearance could be connected to him. As a result, the local police launched a full-scale search. Over 100 officers were assigned to the case, along with helicopters and even an airplane to scan the area from above. They concentrated their efforts along the route the third driver was believed to have taken with Celine. But, despite all their efforts, they found no trace of her. Unfortunately, the first week of the search yielded no results. Both the police and Celine's family made numerous public appeals, urging anyone who might know something about her whereabouts or the driver himself to come forward. But every lead they followed quickly turned into a dead end. This went on for over a week, until the morning of December 29th, when police received a chilling call. A man driving near the town of Worcester had pulled over to adjust his windshield wipers. While walking along the roadside, he noticed something odd partially covered by snow. Curious, he went closer and, to his horror, realized it was a human body. Shaken, he immediately rushed home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman, but, at first, they couldn't identify her. Initially, they thought it might be the remains of a local woman who had disappeared after leaving a nightclub, but the theory was quickly ruled out. It wasn't until the following day, December 30th, that police confirmed the body was Celine's. Her cousin was brought in to identify her, sparing her parents the heartbreaking task of doing it themselves. Police quickly noticed one important detail. The highway where Celine's body was found was almost in the opposite direction of where she had been heading. This only strengthened their theory that the truck driver who had given her a ride was likely responsible for her murder. All of Celine's clothing and personal belongings were missing, and officers found no trace of them near the site where her body was discovered. The autopsy revealed multiple bruises and abrasions consistent with heavy blows, as well as evidence of strangulation. Medical examiners also found signs of SA on Celine's body, but there was no biological material that could lead them to the perpetrator. One chilling detail stood out. The examiners determined that Celine's body had likely been left by the roadside only about 24 hours before it was found. With 11 days having passed since her disappearance, detectives speculated that the killer may have kept her alive for most of that time, or even transported her body with him. The second driver who had helped Celine mentioned that the suspect's truck was equipped with an industrial freezer, which suggested the killer could have preserved her body at low temperatures for days. Despite all this, the police still had no solid leads on the driver's identity. However, a conversation with Celine's parents revealed an intriguing detail. She had been carrying 2 bottles of champagne as Christmas gifts. These, along with all her other belongings, were never found. It seemed likely that the killer had taken them, which gave investigators a potential new angle to explore. This champagne was a specific French brand that wasn't sold in Britain, making those 2 bottles completely unique in the country. Police decided to use this as leverage and sent information about the bottles to the media, along with photos of identical champagne. They hoped that the perpetrator might have shown them to someone, or even shared them with friends or family. But, unfortunately, this lead also went nowhere. Without any other leads in hand, investigators decided to take an unprecedented step. Despite the absence of the perpetrator's DNA on the victim's body, in early January of the following year, they initiated the first mass DNA collection in Britain's history. The police focused their efforts on drivers of Mercedes trucks and similar models. This process took over a month, and detectives managed to test more than 5,000 drivers. Most of them willingly provided their samples, but there were some who refused. Investigators put them on a separate list for further scrutiny, thinking that one of those individuals might be the killer. Meanwhile, Celine's case continued to gain widespread attention in both British and French media. The police received thousands of tips and leads, but unfortunately, none of them brought the detectives any closer to catching the killer. This continued until mid-February, when one tip finally caught the investigators' attention. A man called the police after seeing the suspect's sketch on the news and said it looked strikingly similar to one of his coworkers, a 36-year-old truck driver named Stuart Little. He also mentioned that Stuart drove a Mercedes truck with a refrigeration unit. This lead prompted detectives to start digging into Stuart's background. The first thing they uncovered was Stuart's extensive criminal history, though it consisted of non-violent offenses. Next, they decided to approach him carefully and ask for a DNA sample, presenting it as a routine part of their investigation involving thousands of drivers across Britain. However, Stuart refused to provide a sample, which only deepened their suspicions. After several more attempts to persuade him, though, Stuart eventually gave in and agreed to the test. As soon as they had his DNA, the police secured a warrant to search his truck. That's when they found their first major evidence: traces of blood on the mattress in the sleeping area and in other parts of the cab. Testing confirmed it was Celine's blood, and that was enough for an arrest. The police also obtained a warrant to search Stuart's house. In his garage, they discovered Celine's personal belongings, the ones she had with her when she disappeared. But that wasn't all. Investigators noticed something odd about Stuart's tachograph, the device truck drivers are required to use by law to track their driving hours. It appeared that on the day Celine's body was dumped, Stuart had deliberately concealed information about his movements. However, he made a mistake. After disposing of the body, he resumed work without filling in the missing data. This created a suspicious gap in his driving log, which detectives believed corresponded to the time he transported Celine's body to the roadside. During his first interrogation, Stuart denied any involvement in the murder, claiming he had never even picked up Celine. But when police brought in the other driver, who identified Stuart in a lineup, his story changed. He now admitted to giving Celine a ride and claimed they had consensual intercourse. As for her belongings found in his garage, Stuart insisted she had simply forgotten them when he dropped her off. Naturally, investigators weren't quick to believe Stuart's story. They continued searching for evidence and soon found a witness who had seen him the day before Celine's body was discovered. The witness spotted Stuart near a warehouse, about 50 miles from where the body was found. He was seen starting a fire next to his truck, and it appeared he was burning something. When police confronted Stuart about this, he claimed he'd started the fire to warm up his truck brakes, which had supposedly frozen due to the weather. Officers decided to search the area near the warehouse, and it didn't take long for them to find something disturbing. Underneath a fence, they discovered Celine's underwear. It was stained with her blood. Piecing together all the evidence, investigators came up with the most likely timeline of events. When Stuart picked up Celine, he drove to a secluded area where he assaulted and killed her. Based on the blood evidence found in his truck, they believe Stuart kept her body on the lower bunk in his cab for 10 days, while continuing to make deliveries as if nothing had happened. Shockingly, just a week after the murder, Stuart went home to celebrate Christmas with his wife and children, while Celine's body remained just a few yards away in his truck. At some point, he decided to dispose of the body. Investigators found receipts showing Stuart had purchased a shovel, an axe, and a saw, likely with the intention of dismembering her remains. However, for some reason, he abandoned that plan and simply left her body near the roadside. Detectives soon uncovered another chilling detail. The day after Christmas, Stuart gave those 2 bottles of rare French champagne to an acquaintance as a gift. When detectives questioned him about it, Stuart claimed he'd bought the bottles from another French truck driver, but investigators didn't believe a word of it. On top of that, they uncovered another intriguing detail. Stuart had always worn a beard, but he completely shaved it off after the murder, right around the time the suspect's sketch started appearing in the news. They also figured out why Celine couldn't reach her cousin when she tried to call him from a payphone. It turned out that the UK had recently changed its phone codes, and Celine had his number written down with the old code in her notebook. Unaware of this update, she dialed the outdated number, and her call never went through. For Stuart's family, friends, and coworkers, these revelations were a complete shock. To them, he had always seemed like a devoted family man and a reliable friend. At first, many even refused to believe he could have been involved. But, as the media revealed the mounting evidence against him, they had no choice but to face the horrifying truth of who Stuart really was. Stuart's trial began in October of that year, and, despite the mountain of evidence against him, he stuck to his story, denying everything. But the jury didn't need long to deliberate. They unanimously found him guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving at least 20 years. Soon after his sentencing, Stuart tried to appeal the verdict, claiming that the high-profile nature of the case had biased the jury, preventing him from receiving a fair trial. However, the appeals court rejected his claims. In 2006, Stuart made another attempt to have his sentence reviewed, but once again, his appeal was denied. 10 years later, in 2016, Stuart became eligible for parole, but his request was denied. The reason was clear. Even after spending 2 decades in prison, he still refused to admit to the crime and maintained his innocence. The judge also voiced concerns that Stuart remained a danger to society. As of now, Stuart remains behind bars, with little chance of being released anytime soon. It's worth mentioning that Stuart was ultimately ruled out as a suspect in the other murders I mentioned earlier. Those crimes turned out to be the work of another truck driver who was arrested in late 1997. While prosecutors linked him to just 2 murders, they still believe he might be responsible for several other unsolved cases. As for Stuart, investigators also suspected that Celine might not have been his only victim. However, after all these years, no evidence has been found to connect him to any other crimes. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A young mother planned to visit her parents for Christmas, but she never came. Just before the holiday, she stopped getting in touch and disappeared without a trace. Her parents began searching for their daughter, uncovering strange and frightening clues along the way. Soon, the detectives faced an unexpected twist that shocked everyone involved in the case, as none of them had ever encountered anything like that. At the end, this wild twist pushed the case forward and helped them to unravel the truth. Melissa Wolfenbarger was born on September 9, 1977, in the small American town of Locust Grove, Georgia. She was the youngest child in her family, and her older sister, who was 7 years old when Melissa was born, helped their mom take care of her from day one. As they grew up, the sisters formed a really close bond. In high school, Melissa met a guy named Christopher, and soon after graduating, they got married. The couple settled in a quiet suburb of Atlanta, where Christopher landed a job at a glass manufacturing plant. Not long after moving, Melissa got pregnant and they welcomed a daughter, followed by a son a little later. By 1998, 21-year-old Melissa was spending most of her time at home taking care of the kids. Even though she was quite young, she was happy with her growing family. Melissa also tried to visit her parents and sister as often as she could, but with the distance and all her responsibilities, those visits were rare. They planned to spend Christmas with their family that year, and a month before, on Thanksgiving, Melissa called her mom to ask for a special gift. She wanted some old photo of her grandfather. Her mother went through all the family albums, found the perfect photo, and began waiting for her daughter and the grandkids to arrive. But when Christmas came, Melissa didn't show up. At first, her parents were a bit surprised since they'd planned this for over a month, but they figured she might just be too busy. After all, she had 2 small kids to care for, and she'd also recently started working at a cafe because Christopher's income wasn't enough to support the whole family. The situation was complicated by the fact that they couldn't just call Melissa and ask why she didn't come. There was no phone in her house and, back then, cell phones weren't common. Melissa usually called them from her in-laws' house, but since her last call on Thanksgiving, she hadn't reached out once. Her parents decided to wait, but when Melissa didn't call on her mother's birthday, they started to worry something might be wrong. That's when they decided to head to Atlanta to check on her. However, they were met with a surprising discovery. Melissa and Christopher's house was completely empty. After speaking with the neighbors, they learned that the family had moved out right after Christmas, but no one knew where they had gone. This only made her parents more confused. They couldn't imagine that Melissa just moved somewhere else without telling them. Eventually, they got in touch with Christopher's parents and, through them, finally reached Christopher himself. But the whole situation became even more puzzling. He claimed Melissa had left him back in December and he hadn't seen her since. According to him, she had decided to move to California and start a new life, leaving him and their kids behind. Her parents found Christopher's story hard to believe. First off, they couldn't imagine Melissa abandoning her kids, who were only 1 and 2 years old. Plus, if she had really decided to move, they were sure she would have reached out or visited at some point, but that never happened. Despite their doubts, Christopher stuck to his story, and Melissa's parents couldn't get any more information out of him. They returned home, unsure of what to do next, but determined to find their daughter. Over the next few months, they tried to track her down, reaching out to friends and relatives, but it was as if Melissa had vanished into thin air. In the spring of 1999, Melissa's mother saw a news report about Atlanta police finding a human head in a bag, soaked in bleach, in a wooded area. A few days later, they discovered 4 more bags containing other body parts. What immediately caught her attention was that the site was near Christopher's old job, and she feared the remains could belong to her daughter. However, the police later said that the head belonged to a missing man from another cold case. By early 2000, her parents finally decided to involve the police, but it didn't help much. Investigators spoke with Christopher and concluded that Melissa had likely left her family to start a new life, which is why she hadn't reached out. As a result, the police didn't pursue the case, but Melissa's parents refused to believe that she had just walked away from her old life. In fact, with each passing month, they became more convinced that something bad had happened to her, and they suspected Christopher was involved. Her parents knew the couple had been having serious problems. Christopher had physically abused Melissa several times, leading her to leave him and stay with her parents, bringing the kids along. But every time, he'd apologize and talk her into coming back. This fact only made Christopher's story more suspicious. If he had done everything he could to get her back in the past, why hadn't he done anything this time? He didn't call her parents, didn't go to the police, and made no effort to stop her from leaving. Another odd detail was that, according to Christopher, Melissa hadn't taken anything with her. No clothes, no jewelry, not even her documents. It all seemed incredibly strange, but without help from the police, Melissa's parents felt powerless to do anything about it. For the next few years, there was still no sign of Melissa. But, in 2003, everything changed, and in the most shocking way. Police were investigating the murder of a woman from back in 1977. The case had been cold for 26 years, but it was recently reopened. After reviewing the evidence and running a DNA test, detectives identified the killer. It was Carl Patton, Melissa's father. But that was just the beginning. Once police arrested him, Carl offered them a deal. He agreed to confess to 3 more murders in exchange for full immunity for his wife, who had helped him with the killings. As part of the deal, Melissa's mother also agreed to testify against her husband, and eventually she was granted immunity. According to their confessions, in December 1977, a woman named Mary, who was close to Carl, offered him $15,000 to kill her husband. The reason? Her husband had been cheating on her, plus Mary had taken out life insurance on him and wanted to cash in. Carl agreed, and brought in a friend to help carry out the murder. However, when they approached the man, his lover was with him, so they decided to kill her too. They dumped the woman's body in a river and left the man's body in his car on train tracks, hoping to make it look like an accident. A month later, Carl told his wife that his partner had apparently blabbed about the crime to his girlfriend, and now he wanted to take care of. Carl invited the couple to his home, killed them, and with his wife's help, disposed of the bodies by throwing them into a river. She also helped him clean the crime scene and the van they had used to transport the bodies. Later, Carl confessed to a fifth murder that took place 5 years before the others. It was again Mary who had offered him money, this time to kill her first husband, and Carl agreed. As a result, Carl was charged with 5 murders, and the police immediately suspected him in Melissa's disappearance. But Carl insisted he would never harm his daughter and had nothing to do with it. Upon further investigation, detectives concluded that Carl was probably telling the truth. Initially, they had only suspected him of 1 murder, but he voluntarily confessed to 4 more. Carl claimed he deeply regretted his actions, and it was this remorse that drove him to confess. But that wasn't all. Seizing the moment, Carl decided to ask for a favor. He requested a meeting with the lead detective who had tied him to the murder and said, "You managed to catch me, so maybe you can find my daughter." The detective was intrigued by the whole situation. Here was a man who had committed 5 murders, now asking him to investigate his daughter's disappearance. It was an unusual situation, to put it lightly, and the detective agreed to look into it. He began reviewing the limited information about Melissa's disappearance and quickly noticed one specific detail: those bags of human remains found near Christopher's workplace 4 years earlier. At the time, police had assumed the remains belonged to a man, but the detective discovered that this assumption wasn't based on forensic evidence, just a guess. Given the fact that the remains were found in an advanced state of decomposition, he decided to have them re-examined and ordered a DNA test, as he already had Carl's DNA on file. The results confirmed his suspicion: the remains didn't belong to a man, they belonged to Melissa. After this breakthrough, police finally established that Melissa had been dead for several years, not missing, and her case was officially reclassified as a homicide. According to the medical examiner's report, the victim's body had been dismembered using a reciprocating electric saw. Melissa's torso was never found, which was quite odd. The police conducted multiple searches in the wooded area where the other remains were found, but still couldn't locate it. Despite this, investigators uncovered one interesting lead. They began looking deeper into Christopher and interviewed his former employer at the glass factory where he had worked until Melissa's disappearance. It turned out that Christopher had been fired around the same time for allegedly stealing an electric saw of the same type used to dismember Melissa's body. Melissa's mother also revealed to the police that Christopher had a history of physically abusing her daughter. On top of that, he had a criminal record. Another suspicious detail was that Christopher had changed his name almost immediately after Melissa's death, with no clear reason for doing so. All of this made Christopher the prime suspect in her murder, but the police had no hard evidence against him. They interviewed him multiple times, but he stuck to his original story, although he frequently changed certain details. During one conversation, Christopher claimed Melissa had a lover and ran away with him. Later, he stated that she wanted to sell fake IDs, which explained why she hadn't contacted anyone. The police also uncovered another interesting fact. Shortly after moving from their house, Christopher left his children to live with his parents and hardly ever played a role in their lives since then. He visited them sometimes, but the children didn't even understand that he was their father. But, unfortunately, none of this brought the investigators closer to an arrest because they needed some solid evidence. They obtained a warrant to search the house where Melissa had lived at the time of her death. Given that the killer had used an electric saw, detectives believed the murder likely took place in that house, and they hoped to find blood traces or other evidence. Forensic experts meticulously examined every inch of the house, taking samples from the floor and other surfaces. Unfortunately, their analysis yielded no results. The forensic technology of the time was far less advanced than it is today, leaving the detectives with no choice but to store the collected materials in the evidence warehouse, hoping that one day they might prove useful. The detectives made several more attempts to find new leads and get Christopher to talk, but each effort came up empty. The case eventually went cold again for many years. Meanwhile, Melissa's father was convicted and sentenced to 5 life terms plus 20 years in prison. It's worth noting that Mary, the woman who had paid him for 2 of the murders, had passed away in the late 80s, so she never faced any punishment for her role. Melissa's mother and her older sister continued trying to push the investigation forward on their own. They worked to keep the case in the media spotlight and stayed in regular contact with the detectives, but their efforts didn't yield any progress. This continued until 2017, and Melissa's mother never gave up hope of finding justice for her daughter. That year, she decided to attend an event where true crime enthusiasts gathered to discuss cold cases and search for new leads. One of the attendees was a crime analyst named Cheryl McCullum, and Melissa's mother decided to ask her for help. She shared the story of her daughter's disappearance and added something that immediately caught Cheryl off guard. The woman said, "My husband committed 5 murders, and I helped him." Cheryl became intrigued by the case and, after the event, she began to dig into it thoroughly. She spoke with Melissa's family and even kept in contact with her father, who was serving time in prison. What struck Cheryl the most was how a man who had committed 5 murders seemed more concerned that his daughter's murder would never be solved. Over the next few years, Cheryl collected all the available information on the case and came to the conclusion that the most obvious suspect was Melissa's husband, Christopher. Although there was no direct evidence against him, the overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence left little doubt. He had a history of domestic violence against Melissa, made no effort to find her after she disappeared, and simply moved on with his life as if nothing had happened. But the most incriminating detail was the fact that, shortly before Melissa's death, Christopher had been accused by his employer of stealing the exact type of saw used to dismember her body. No one in Melissa's family doubted Christopher's guilt, including her children. By the time Cheryl became interested in the case, they had grown up and also tried to help her solve it. Cheryl also consulted some prominent figures in the true crime community, including journalist Nancy Grace and several law enforcement officials. After reviewing all the material she had gathered, they all agreed Christopher was the most likely suspect. Despite this, there wasn't a single undeniable piece of evidence against him, and the case remained at a standstill. At that point, Nancy Grace suggested that Cheryl start her own podcast to draw more attention to the case. Publicity can often become a crucial factor in unsolved cases. It might attract new witnesses who might not realize the significance of the information they hold, potentially changing the course of the investigation. Eventually, Cheryl decided to launch the podcast, and in 2023, she released the first episode about Melissa's case. Since then, she has recorded numerous episodes featuring the victim's mother and other relatives. Cheryl presented all the information she had gathered over the years, yet there was still no progress in the case. This continued until April 2024, when the long-awaited breakthrough in the case finally happened. After she published another episode, a witness reached out to Cheryl stating that he had stumbled upon the podcast and might have valuable information. This individual shared that just before Melissa's disappearance, he witnessed a serious argument between her and Christopher. The details of his account remain unknown, as it all took place only a few months prior and detectives chose not to disclose this information for the sake of the investigation. According to some sources, it seems that during this argument, Christopher allegedly threatened Melissa, and Cheryl passed his story on to the police. This became a turning point, prompting investigators to reopen the case. Over the next 3 months, police reviewed the case materials, interviewed everyone involved, and examined the evidence using modern technology. Experts analyzed the bags containing the remains, along with various samples from Christopher and Melissa's home, where the murder apparently took place. In August 2024, investigators held a press conference to announce that, 25 years after Melissa's death, her husband had finally been arrested. As with the witness testimony, police did not disclose specific details about the evidence they discovered during the renewed investigation. Some sources suggest that modern analysis tools may have uncovered DNA traces or other substantial evidence confirming Christopher's involvement in the murder. The reason detectives are withholding details is fairly standard. The more information is available before the trial, the greater the chances that the defense can use it to their advantage and find ways to challenge the evidence. Currently, Christopher is in jail awaiting trial, and a preliminary hearing where he will plead either guilty or not guilty has yet to take place. Melissa's relatives have little doubt that he will evade justice, and neither do the investigators. It seems they have indeed uncovered serious evidence that will be extremely difficult to dispute. At this moment, the case is drawing closer to its conclusion, though it has taken nearly 26 years. Melissa's story has spread across the country as its details are truly astonishing. Initially, police were able to confirm that the victim was no longer alive only because her father had been arrested for 5 murders and asked investigators for help. Then, the podcast played a crucial role in attracting the witness whose testimony led to the reopening of the investigation and ultimately Christopher's arrest. As for Melissa's children, they also believe in their father's guilt and hope that justice will prevail soon. Besides waiting for a guilty verdict, they want to learn the full truth and Christopher's motives, but that will only be possible if he confesses. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a mother who vanished from her home under strange circumstances. Police launched an investigation and uncovered unexpected and even bizarre clues. They eventually pieced together the truth, leaving even seasoned detectives shocked. This case quickly became one of the most talked about in the country, as its details left everyone outraged. Tara Lynn Grant was born on June 22, 1972, in Michigan. She spent most of her childhood on a farm with her parents and sister. Tara loved being outdoors, riding horses, and helping her parents with other animals on the farm. In school, Tara was very active in sports. She was on the cheerleading and basketball teams, and also played in the school band. After high school, Tara attended the University of Michigan, where she met a guy named Steven. They started dating and got married soon after her graduation. Tara, who earned a business degree, got a job at a large international company. Steven, on the other hand, planned to go into politics. He had been an assistant to a state senator during his time in university. But when the senator retired, Steven was left without a job. So, he started working at a small tool-making shop owned by his father. 4 years after their wedding, the couple had a daughter, and a few years later, a son. After their second child was born, the family bought a new house in a prestigious neighborhood in Macomb County, Michigan, right outside of Detroit. By then, Tara had made significant progress in her career, but it came with its drawbacks. She had to travel a lot for work, often flying to different states and countries, which meant she could only spend weekends at home with her family. Because of this, Steven took on most of the childcare responsibilities. His job at his father's company allowed him a flexible schedule so he could spend more time with the kids, but it was still challenging for him to juggle work and childcare, so they decided to hire a full-time nanny. There is a special program that helps families find a nanny from another country who would live with them full-time and take care of the children. Thanks to her job, Tara could afford to hire such a nanny, and soon they found the right person. They hired a young woman from Germany who quickly got along with their children and took on most of the childcare duties. Steven, who got more free time, also started working part-time as a youth soccer coach. But, despite the family's good financial situation, Tara's constant absence strained her relationship with Steven. She was only home on weekends, and they began arguing more frequently because of it. Tara hoped that after her next promotion, she could adjust her schedule to spend more time at home. But until then, she was away on business trips almost every day. This went on until February 14, 2007, when something unexpected happened. On Valentine's Day, Steven called the police and told them that Tara had been out of touch for 5 days, which was quite unusual. He explained that on the evening of February 9th, Tara returned from a business trip and told him she had to leave a day earlier this time, spending just 1 day with the family. This led to another argument between them, and Tara started packing her suitcase. A few minutes later, Steven heard her talking on the phone, saying, "I'll be waiting at the end of the street," before she left the house and got into some dark-colored car. Since then, Tara hadn't been in touch and didn't answer any of his calls. The police's first question was why Steven waited 5 days before reporting her disappearance. But Steven said he initially didn't see any cause for concern. He thought Tara just went on her business trip early and wasn't answering his calls because of the argument. However, over the next few days, He started to worry because she hadn't been in touch for so long. Normally, when she was away, she'd call the kids, who were only 3 and 7 years old, but not this time. On Monday, Tara's boss called him and said she hadn't shown up for a meeting. This was also very odd and meant she hadn't gone to work. Stephen called her relatives and told them what was happening, but they assumed Tara just needed time away from the constant arguments with him. She had told her parents several times that her relationship with Stephen was getting more and more problematic because of her job, and they argued quite often. So, her relatives thought she decided to take a break from Stephen and would soon come back home. As time went by, Tara still didn't show up and she didn't answer any calls. Eventually, Stephen began to worry that something might have happened to her and decided to contact the police. As Stephen answered the police's questions, they noticed several suspicious scratches on him. Detectives asked if the argument with his wife had turned physical, but Stephen denied it. He claimed that he often works with metal parts at his father's shop and gets scratched by them regularly. After the interview at the station, detectives said they needed to search their home, and Stephen agreed. They arrived and found that all of Tara's belongings, including her documents and purse, were missing along with her suitcase. Stephen also gave them access to Tara's computer, where they examined her bank account. There were no transactions since the day of her disappearance, which seemed odd. If she had gone somewhere, she would have needed to buy plane tickets, book a hotel, and so on. But there were no activities on her account for the past 5 days. During the search of the house, detectives found no clues that could shed light on Tara's disappearance. There was no indication that she could have been the victim of any crime, so they were left trying to trace her movements since February 9th. The local police department had little experience investigating such cases because the area was considered one of the safest in the country. Most of the time, they dealt with minor neighbor disputes and other nonviolent incidents. They asked Stephen to undergo a polygraph test, but he was outraged by the fact that the police considered his involvement. He said he would never harm his wife and began to cry. The police left his house and began to consider their next steps. But the following morning, Stephen suddenly called them and said he was ready for the interrogation. However, just a few moments later, his lawyer contacted the detectives and told them that he had advised his client against it. The police obviously considered Stephen as the person of interest, as he was Tara's husband. Besides being standard practice in such cases, they simply couldn't find any other leads. Tara's relatives, friends, and colleagues all said they hadn't heard from her since February 9th and had no idea where she could be. There was no activity on her bank account either, although she would have clearly needed to make some purchases. Detectives began to think how they could interrogate Stephen, and quickly found something interesting. His driver's license had been revoked, but he continued to drive his car. So, officers waited for him to get behind the wheel and arrested him. But he once again felt like the police were treating him as a suspect and refused to talk to them. His lawyer quickly bailed him out and Stephen returned home. The police continued to search for clues and requested Tara's mobile phone records. Her last call was made on the day of her disappearance. She called Stephen from the airport and said she would be home soon. After that, she received numerous calls from Stephen, but they all went to voicemail. Detectives listened to these recordings. Stephen repeatedly asked her to answer or call back and accused her of neglecting their children. He also pleaded with her to come home for their sake. The phone itself was turned off, and based on data from the cell phone carrier, the last time it connected to cell towers was in the vicinity of Tara's house on the evening of her disappearance. Interestingly, the police found no incoming calls during that period. And as we recall, Stephen mentioned that someone called Tara before she left the house and said she would be waiting on the street. But, despite this, from Stephen's voicemail recordings, detectives got a feeling that he genuinely worried about his wife and was angry with her for leaving their children. Although they didn't rush to rule him out as a suspect, they couldn't find any new leads either. Stephen still refused to talk to the police, accusing them of wasting time on him instead of searching for Tara. Instead, he actively engaged with the media, which began covering the case from the early days. Tara's mysterious disappearance quickly drew widespread public attention, and Stephen appeared in front of cameras almost every day, pleading for her to come home. When information about the case reached the company through which Stephen and Tara hired the nanny, they decided to send her back to Germany. Before leaving, she gave a statement to the police and spoke positively about her time in their home. She also mentioned that on the evening Tara came home, she was at a bar with friends. When she returned home, she saw Stephen, who seemed upset and told her that Tara had just left the house. Despite Stephen's refusal to cooperate with the police, he hired a private detective, a former FBI agent, who conducted his own investigation, but also failed to find Tara. With no leads on their hands, the police decided to try a different approach. They contacted the company through which Tara and Stephen found the nanny, and here they found something interesting. Before hiring the woman from Germany, they had a total of 6 nannies, but none of them stayed in the job for long. Detectives spoke to them and almost all said that Stephen's behavior seemed not only strange, but also frightening to them. According to their accounts, he rummaged through their belongings, asked intimate questions, and often yelled at them, treating them as if they were supposed to follow his commands. The police then wondered why the last nanny from Germany portrayed her time with the family in a completely different light, with only positive words about Stephen. They secured permission to monitor her emails and phone, leading to an unexpected revelation. Detectives uncovered messages between her and Stephen, revealing they had been having an affair. It emerged that the 19-year-old had been involved in an intimate relationship with him during Tara's business trips, which persisted until she was forced to leave the country. Although this was an important lead for the police, infidelity did not prove Stephen's involvement in Tara's disappearance, so they continued to search for other evidence. Speaking with Tara's relatives and friends, detectives learned that nearly all of them had disliked Stephen since she married him. According to them, he behaved quite strangely, tried to control her every move, and didn't get along with anyone in her family. Investigators soon learned something else. Stephen's former girlfriend, whom he had dated before meeting Tara, called the police and told them something interesting. According to her, Stephen had reached out to her several months prior, and their conversations gradually became more intimate. Eventually, Stephen began openly expressing his desire to engage in a romantic relationship with her, despite both of them being married. Stephen also complained about Tara and her constant absence. According to him, he suspected her of cheating on him with her boss. He even admitted to installing special software on her computer, which he used to read her messages, but found no evidence to confirm his suspicions. All of this made the police even more inclined to consider the husband's possible involvement in Tara's disappearance, but they still needed some evidence. When several weeks had passed since her disappearance, they began to consider the possibility that she might no longer be alive and launched extensive searches for her body. They enlisted volunteers and began searching the area within a radius of several miles from Tara's home, as well as a large park nearby. The search went on for several days, but it yielded no results. This continued until February 28th, when a local resident called the police. The woman came to the same park for a walk, aware of Tara's disappearance and the ongoing search for her body, so she remained vigilant and kept an eye out for anything unusual. Soon enough, she did notice something strange. Under one of the trees along the trail, there was a plastic bag covered with branches and snow. It was clearly filled with something, and the woman decided to take a closer look. Through the bag, she saw rubber gloves and something resembling metal shavings inside, and there was something dark red at the bottom. She decided to take the bag with her and handed it over to the police. Detectives immediately realized that there was likely blood at the bottom of the bag and sent it to the lab. But there was a problem. Experts warned that due to a high workload, DNA analysis could take up to 2 months. Nevertheless, they examined the contents and confirmed that it did indeed seem to be human blood. The police immediately focused their search efforts in the area where the bag was found, deploying all available resources. Stephen did not participate in the search, citing bias from the police. Instead, he gave a lengthy interview to a news channel, making quite a few questionable statements. He repeatedly criticized Tara for being absent from her home most of the time, labeling her a bad mother. Stephen claimed he took on almost all parenting responsibilities and was a better mom than she was. When reporters asked about their financial situation and whether he had been living mostly on Tara's money, Stephen became angry and insisted he didn't need a penny from her. During the interview, Stephen also accused Tara of infidelity without providing any evidence. Throughout the conversation, he repeatedly condemned Tara and emphasized how difficult their marriage had been for him. As Stephen was giving the interview, the detectives made some progress. They had previously tried to obtain a search warrant for Tara's home without success due to insufficient grounds, and Stephen had prevented them from searching it voluntarily. However, after the blood-stained bag was discovered in the park, the judge granted the warrant. The police arrived at the house, and around the same time Stephen returned after the interview, detectives informed him of the warrant to search his home, and Stephen opened the door for them before calling his lawyer. The lawyer inquired if his client was under arrest, and the police answered, "No." Stephen then said he would take his dog for a walk, fetched it from the house, and left, while the police began the search. They went through room by room, eventually reaching the garage. One of the detectives noticed a large green container with several plastic bags inside. Slitting one open, they found an unknown substance, along with what appeared to be women's clothing. Opening another bag, the officer realized with horror that it likely contained human remains. In total, there were 5 bags in the container, and the detectives quickly confirmed that they indeed contained the remains of a woman. The police realized that they had found Tara's body and Stephen must be her murderer. However, Stephen had not returned, so the police immediately began searching for him. They feared he might flee or harm someone else, knowing he was likely going to prison anyway. Meanwhile, officers called in reinforcements for the park search, as only a portion of Tara's remains were found in the garage. Over 100 officers from neighboring districts were dispatched to assist, and their efforts quickly paid off. Several hundred yards from where the bag was discovered, they found another part of the body, and later, they found the head. Due to the cold temperatures, the remains were well preserved, allowing detectives to confirm they belonged to Tara. They found several more body parts, and as night fell, the search was suspended until morning. All this time, detectives also tried to locate Stephen, but to no avail. They reached out to his friends, and one of them revealed that Stephen had called him, informing him about the search at his house, and asked to pick him up from the street. Stephen's friend drove there and took him to his home. On the way, he noticed that Stephen behaved quite strangely. He seemed scared, his hands were shaking, and overall, it felt like Stephen was on the verge of a breakdown. When they arrived at the friend's house, Stephen said he wanted to see his children and asked to borrow the friend's car. At that time, Stephen's children were in another state under the care of his sister. The friend gave him his pickup and Stephen left. The police requested information about his phone and credit cards, allowing them to quickly determine his route. They saw that Stephen withdrew money several times on the way to the neighboring state and called his sister. So, the police realized he was heading to his children and immediately set off in that direction. Then, something unexpected happened. The police received a call from Germany, from the very nanny with whom Stephen had had a romantic relationship. She told them that Stephen had just called her and confessed to killing Tara. According to him, they indeed had an argument that evening and Stephen started yelling at her. Tara then slapped him in the face and he flew into a rage. He pushed her and Tara hit her head after falling on the floor, resulting in her death. The police no longer doubted Stephen's involvement, but they still needed to find him. For several hours, they searched the area along the highway leading to the neighboring state, and soon they discovered Stephen's friend's car. It was abandoned near the entrance to the national park, but Stephen himself was nowhere to be seen. The police headed to the park, and several hours later, thanks to thermal cameras, they finally found him. Stephen was lying under a tree, wearing only light clothing, and the officers realized he was on the brink of death from hypothermia. He was in an altered state, talking to trees and muttering incomprehensible phrases, so they quickly airlifted him to the hospital. Despite the fact that his body temperature dropped to just 88 degrees, doctors managed to save his life, although it took some time for him to fully recover. While he was in the hospital, he was charged with murder, and detectives handed the case over to the court. It's worth mentioning that on the same day, his lawyer refused to defend Stephen. When asked why, he vaguely replied, "I need to be able to look at myself in the mirror in the mornings." Stephen was assigned a new lawyer, and meanwhile, forensic experts examined Tara's remains. one of the most experienced pathologists in the country, who had worked on the JFK and JonBenet Ramsey cases, was appointed as the chief medical examiner. After studying the remains, he concluded that Stephen's version of events did not match reality. Stephen claimed Tara died from a head injury, but the actual cause of death turned out to be strangulation. When Stephen finally regained consciousness, detectives went to see him in the hospital and he told them what really happened that evening. According to him, when Tara came home and said she had to leave a day earlier, they got into an argument and he started yelling at her. When she tried to leave the room, he grabbed her and Tara hit him in the face. Stephen struck back, then strangled her. He dragged her body from the second floor to the garage and placed Tara in the trunk of her car. At the same time, the nanny returned home, and Stephen told her that his wife had just left him. The next morning, he took the body to his father's workshop, making sure no other workers would be there. Stephen destroyed all of Tara's documents and personal belongings, then dismembered her body using a saw. He also mentioned that he vomited twice while doing all this, but he kept telling himself, "If you don't do this, you'll end up in prison for the rest of your days." Several hours later, he packed the remains into plastic bags, placed them in a container, and returned home, leaving the body in the car. For a few days, he'd been thinking how to dispose of the remains while creating an alibi for himself. He repeatedly called Tara and left messages on her voicemail, begging her to come home. One day, he took his children's snow sled and went to the park where the bags with the remains would later be found. He placed the container on the sled to take it away from the crowded areas and started pulling it up a hill. At some point, the rope slipped from his hands and the sled rolled down. The container overturned and the bags with the remains spilled out. Stephen picked them up, put the container back on the sled, and after a while buried the bags under the snow in remote areas before returning home. Several days later, when the police began searching for Tara, detectives announced they were starting a search operation in the park. Stephen panicked. He remembered that one of the bags, the largest one, was hidden quite poorly, so he feared it would be found pretty quickly. So, he walked to the park, took a few bags, slung them over his shoulder, and carried them to his father's workshop, leaving them right on the roof. The day before his interview, he took the container from home, went to the workshop, retrieved the bags, and brought them back to his garage. To his surprise, the next day, the police obtained a search warrant for the house, where they found these bags in the container. After that, Stephen confessed that when his guilt became apparent, he had not planned to surrender alive. However, he couldn't carry out his plan and survived despite almost freezing to death. Throughout the conversation with the police, Stephen showed no signs of remorse. On the contrary, he often smiled and joked, even when describing how he disposed of the body. While Stephen awaited trial in prison, his children continued living with his sister. However, Tara's family wasn't happy with this arrangement. Stephen's sister continued to communicate with him, feeling sorry for him, and even joked about Tara's murder. Eventually, Tara's relatives succeeded in having the children stay with Tara's sister, but Stephen's family still had the right to see them. The trial began in November 2007, and Stephen didn't deny his guilt. Nevertheless, his new lawyer tried to argue for a lighter sentence, explaining that Stephen committed the crime after many years of marital problems caused by his wife's frequent absence. During the trial, it also emerged that Stephen lied about Tara's plans to leave a day earlier. Her boss said Tara had no additional meetings scheduled and was supposed to start her work at the usual time. Tara's sister, who spoke with her shortly before the murder, confirmed this. At that time, Tara told her she would be home all weekend, as usual. There was also no evidence to support the claim that Tara was cheating on her husband. Her boss said their relationship was purely professional, and it was confirmed by their email letters and texts. Even Stephen himself admitted that he didn't actually believe it. The prosecution failed to prove that Stephen had planned the murder in advance. Apparently, he committed the crime in a fit of rage, which could have led to charges of second-degree murder rather than first-degree. On December 21, 2007, the jury unanimously found Stephen guilty, and he was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. Stephen's lawyer tried to appeal the verdict, but to no avail. Since then, he has been serving his sentence behind bars, but his story doesn't end there. Tara's murder attracted the attention of millions of people across the country, and Stephen clearly enjoyed it. While in prison, he began writing a book and planned to release it with the help of his sister. They even discussed the possibility of a film adaptation, and Stephen pondered which famous actor could play him. In 2008, something else came to light. Stephen's children told their aunt that they actually saw their father killing their mother. On that fateful evening, they came out of their room after hearing screams and witnessed the entire ordeal. When this information appeared in the media, Stephen's relatives accused the children of lying and continued to defend him. Also in the same year, it became known that Stephen's father, who unlike other relatives didn't support him, could not live with what his son had done, and his body was found in his own home. As of now, Stephen remains behind bars, and he will only be eligible for parole in 2058. Every year, Tara's relatives and friends host a marathon along the route in the park where she used to jog frequently, and her children are always among the participants. Despite their father's actions, they have found the strength to move forward and honor their mother's memory. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A student vanished from her own home in the middle of the night without leaving a single clue behind. Police launched a search, and it didn't take long before a dark picture began to emerge. Piece by piece, detectives uncovered the truth, and what they found would shock the entire country. Eve Carson was born on November 19, 1985, in Athens, Georgia. From a young age, she stood out as someone incredibly driven and focused. In high school, she served as vice president of the student council, volunteered at a nursing home, and a shelter for abused teens. On top of that, she worked as a congressional page and assisted in a stem cell research lab, all while still a student. After graduating high school with honors, Eve enrolled at the University of North Carolina, where she double majored in political science and biology. Her academic achievements earned her a prestigious scholarship, and she quickly became a campus leader, taking on key roles in several student organizations. But she didn't stop there. Eve continued her charity work and even taught science at an elementary school. She also traveled abroad for volunteer missions, spending a summer in Ecuador assisting doctors, studying for a semester in Cuba, and joining a research team in Egypt. Eve was, without question, one of the most exceptional students at her college. She had big dreams for the future, and she was well on her way. Even before graduating, she had already been offered a job at a major company and was planning to start her career right after getting her diploma. In March of 2008, Eve was 22 years old and in her senior year of college. At the time, she was living in a house just off campus with a group of close friends. On the night of March 5th, around 1:30 a.m., her roommates were heading out to a party. They invited Eve to come along, but she turned them down because she had classes to prepare for and wanted to stay in and study. So, her friends left without her and didn't come back until 4:30 in the morning. When they got home, something immediately felt off. The front door was wide open, and the lights were still on inside. But Eve wasn't there, and neither was her car. It didn't make sense. Why would Eve leave in the middle of the night? And why would she leave the door open? Her friends tried calling her, but she didn't answer. Still, they figured maybe something had come up. Maybe she had to run out unexpectedly. So they waited, hoping she'd show up. But, by the next day, there was still no sign of Eve. That's when one of her friends decided it was time to go to the police and report her missing. As soon as Eve's friend explained the situation to investigators, they told her something chilling. They had found human remains earlier that morning, but hadn't yet identified the individual. They showed the friend a photo of the discovery, and she immediately recognized Eve. It turned out that around 5 a.m., just a short time after Eve had gone missing, police got a call from a woman who lived about a mile from Eve's house. She said she was jolted awake by the sound of shots, followed by a terrifying scream. Scared and unsure of what was happening, she called the police. Officers responded to the area and found the body of a young woman lying on the ground. She had no ID, no phone, nothing that could help identify her. The only thing investigators could confirm at the time was that she had been shot multiple times. After Eve's friend identified her, detectives spoke with her roommates and pieced together a rough timeline. At 1:30 a.m., she was at home studying. By 5 a.m., she was found just a mile away. The big question now was, how did she end up there, and who was responsible? Since Eve's car was missing, detectives started to think it might have been a robbery. That theory got even stronger when they searched her room and realized her wallet and credit cards were gone, too. And they weren't anywhere near the body either. The medical examiners also confirmed there were no signs of other types of assault, which helped rule out another possible motive. When police checked her phone records, they saw the last signal came from a cell tower near a highway just outside of town. But the phone itself was never found. It looked like the person responsible had tossed it somewhere out in the woods. Then, detectives got their first real break. A car matching Eve's description had been found abandoned just a few miles from her house. The vehicle was immediately handed over to forensics for fingerprinting and DNA analysis. In the meantime, detectives uncovered something else. Forensic experts analyzed Eve's computer, the one she'd been using to study, and found that it was active until around 3:30 a.m. That meant she was still at home for at least 2 hours after her friends left for the party. Only after that did she somehow end up a mile away. By then, news of Eve's passing had spread across the city, and her college campus was in shock. Nearly everyone knew her. She was involved in almost every major student organization, and no one could believe she was gone. On top of the grief, fear started to set in. People were scared for their own safety, and the fact that police had no solid leads only made it worse. As a result, detectives were flooded with tips. Students called in with anything remotely suspicious, trying to help. But, no matter how many leads came in, none of them brought investigators any closer to solving the mystery. But soon, investigators got a key piece of information. Since it looked like her credit cards were taken, they pulled her transaction history, and what they found was huge. Just 18 minutes after Eve last used her computer, someone withdrew $700 from her account using 2 separate transactions. They then tried to take out more, but hit the daily limit and were denied. The ATM used for the withdrawal was located near a shopping center on the opposite side of town. Detectives immediately requested the security footage, and sure enough, they got a hit. The video showed a man sitting in Eve's car, using her card at the machine. In the back seat, there appeared to be someone else. Investigators suspected it might have been Eve, but the image quality was too poor to say for sure. Forensic specialists tried enhancing the footage to get a clearer view, but it didn't help. Meanwhile, police learned the suspect had tried to use Eve's card at several other ATMs around the city, but none of those machines had surveillance cameras. That continued until March 7th, when police got yet another alert about an attempted withdrawal. This time, the suspect had shown up at a 24-hour convenience store around 12:30 a.m. and tried to use the ATM. But Eve's bank declined the transaction. Officers rushed to the store, which was located in a nearby town, and this one actually had a working security camera. When they pulled the footage from that night, they saw someone trying to use Eve's card. But here's the twist. It wasn't the same man from the earlier ATM footage. Investigators now had to consider the possibility that more than one person was involved. Either that, or her card had been given to someone else. They tried identifying this second suspect, but just like before, the image quality wasn't good enough to get a match. So, detectives turned to the public for help. They released both photos from the surveillance cameras to the media, hoping someone might recognize the suspects. And, since almost everyone in the area had already heard about the case, the phones at the station lit up with tips. But once again, none of them brought police any closer to catching whoever had done this to Eve Carson. That all changed on March 12th, when police finally got a lead that seemed promising. An anonymous caller reached out and said he recognized the man from the second surveillance video, the one from the convenience store. According to him, the guy's name was DeMario Atwater. Detectives started digging into Atwater's background, and what they found was pretty alarming. At just 21 years old, he already had a long criminal record. He'd been arrested multiple times for robbery, assault, drug offenses, and more. He had done some time behind bars, but had also been released early on several occasions. They also learned that just 2 days after the incident, DeMario was supposed to appear in court for getting caught with a handgun while on probation. Investigators pulled up old mug shots of Atwater and compared them to the footage from the convenience store. The resemblance was undeniable. They were clearly looking at the same person. They also found out that DeMario lived near that store, so detectives headed straight to his house. During questioning, DeMario insisted he had nothing to do with it, but the surveillance footage was enough to bring him in. As police kept digging, they found out he was regularly in touch with a 17-year-old named Lawrence Lovett. He, despite his age, already had a record of his own. When detectives looked at Lawrence's mugshots, they instantly recognized him. He was definitely the one behind the wheel of Eve's car in the first ATM footage. But, unlike DeMario, Lawrence wasn't going down without a fight. He barricaded himself inside his house, and things escalated so fast that SWAT had to be called in. When officers finally got him into custody, he also denied having anything to do with it. So, both men were booked and held in jail while they waited for trial. Since neither of them was talking, investigators focused on building their case. They pulled cell phone data, and what they found was quite interesting. On the night Eve was killed, both suspects' phones pinged off a tower near her neighborhood, even though they both lived in another city. Detectives believed that DeMario and Lawrence chose Eve at random, that they were simply out looking for someone to rob, and noticed she was home alone in the middle of the night. Based on the pattern of ATM activity, it seemed they forced her to drive with them to several locations where she gave up her PIN. Once they realized they couldn't get more than $700 because of the daily limit, they drove her out to a wooded area on the edge of town, and that's where her life was taken. Given how brutal the crime was, prosecutors announced they'd be going after the maximum sentence for DeMario. Lawrence's case was more complicated. Since he was a minor, the harshest sentence he could get was life in prison. But prosecutors knew the evidence they had might not be enough for a conviction on its own, so they made a strategic move. They offered DeMario a deal, plead guilty in exchange for taking certain penalties off the table, and he agreed. DeMario admitted that he and Lawrence set out that night looking to commit a robbery and make some quick cash. According to him, Lawrence called and suggested they head over to the university campus to find a victim. While driving through a neighborhood, they spotted Eve through a window in her home, and that's when they made their move. Armed, they broke in and forced her into her own car. After that, they drove to several ATMs, trying to pull out as much money as they could. The whole time, Eve was begging them to let her go. She promised she wouldn't say a word, she just wanted to go home. But they had other plans. According to DeMario, they decided to take her life because she'd seen their faces, even though they never made the slightest effort to hide them. In the end, they drove her to that deserted street and shot her multiple times. DeMario also said something truly heartbreaking. Right before they killed her, Eve asked them to pray with her. Instead, they gunned her down. In April 2010, 2 years after the murder, DeMario was found guilty. Because of the plea deal, the judge gave him life in prison plus another 30 years. After the verdict, DeMario turned to Eve's parents, apologized for what he'd done, and said he deserved whatever punishment he got. As for Lawrence, he refused to plead guilty, and his trial began in December 2011. Despite his lawyer's efforts to convince the jury of his innocence, DeMario's confession, combined with all the evidence, was more than enough. So, Lawrence was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But his story didn't end there. In 2013, the State Court of Appeals overturned his sentence, citing a separate precedent that ruled life without parole for juvenile offenders was too harsh. As a result, Lawrence was granted a new trial. This time, he was a bit more vocal than before. He told the court that everyone makes mistakes, and insisted he wasn't the monster people believed him to be. Still, he showed no real remorse for what he'd done, and in the end, the judge once again sentenced him to life in prison. It's also worth noting that Lawrence was a suspect in another eerily similar case. Back in January 2008, just a few months before Eve's passing, someone broke into the apartment of a 29-year-old student and took his life. Afterward, Money was withdrawn from the victim's account at several ATMs across the city. However, the detectives were never able to gather enough solid evidence to tie Lawrence to that crime, so the charges were eventually dropped. Eve's case didn't just make national headlines, it led to real change. In the summer of 2008, North Carolina lawmakers passed a new law that imposed tougher penalties and stricter procedures for certain types of activity. It went into effect on December 1st and applied to all crimes committed from that day forward. The law was created in direct response to what happened to Eve. At her college, a scholarship was established in her name, and a memorial garden was created on campus to honor her memory. In 2009, one of Eve's close friends became a finalist on American Idol. While performing on stage, he opened up about how her death pushed him to take the leap and audition. He said that without Eve, he never would have found the courage or the drive to chase his dream. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A young family moved into a quiet, peaceful apartment complex, thinking they found the perfect home. But just days later, their lives turned into a nightmare. What happened shocked the entire country. And though the case was solved pretty quickly, its impact still echoes to this day, sparking important changes in the law. Mikhail Bush was born on February 13, 1997, in the Canadian province of Alberta. She grew up there with her parents and a younger sister, who was not only incredibly close to her but also saw her as a role model throughout their lives. Mikhail was a cheerful, energetic, and kind girl, which naturally drew people to her and earned her many friends. One of her biggest passions in life was ice skating. From a young age, she and her parents would often visit local rinks, and over time, it became something she truly loved. While in high school, Mikhail met a boy named Cody, and the two began dating. It didn't take long for them to realize they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. So, after graduation, they started planning their future as a couple. After finishing school, Mikhail got a job at a charity organization that supported people with disabilities. She quickly grew passionate about the work and decided to pursue a career in healthcare, so she could continue helping those in need. In 2017, Mikhail enrolled in a local college and earned her nursing degree. After graduating, she returned to her job at the charity center. But shortly after that, something else happened. Mikhail found out she was pregnant. She and Cody were over the moon with joy, and following the happy news, Cody proposed to her in the middle of a rink. In 2020, they welcomed their son, Noah, and began building their life together as a family. Cody worked in pipeline construction, which meant he was constantly traveling across Canada. It was quite tough. His wife and newborn either had to move around with him or spend weeks without seeing him. But in 2021, he got a new job that finally let him stay in one place. With this new job, the family moved to a small town called Hinton. It was a fairly remote area, but, for the first time, Cody's work no longer required constant travel, and they could finally settle down and spend more time together. In early September 2021, Mikhail and Cody moved into their new apartment in a residential complex on the outskirts of town. At the time, Mikhail was 24 years old, and their son Noah was just 16 months. The family was thrilled with their new home, surrounded by nature, parks, and a sense of peace and quiet. On September 16th, Cody left for work as usual, while Mikhail stayed home to take care of their son. His shift ended around 6 p.m. and he headed back, looking forward to spending the evening with his family. But to his surprise, neither Mikhail nor Noah was home. Cody checked every room, looked out into the yard, but there was no sign of them. At first, he thought Mikhail might have taken Noah for a walk to one of the nearby parks, but then he noticed something odd. Their son's stroller was still inside the apartment, which meant Mikhail couldn't have gone far with him. Then Cody noticed something even more unsettling. On the kitchen table, there were plates with half-prepared food, as if Mikhail had started making lunch, but suddenly stopped and left the house. Cody started to seriously worry and decided to check the nearby parks and playgrounds, thinking Mikhail and Noah might be there. But after searching everywhere, he couldn't find them and returned home. Hoping for answers, He began calling family and friends, thinking someone might have picked them up. That would have explained why Mikhail hadn't taken the stroller, but no one had seen her that day. On top of that, Cody kept trying to call her, but Mikhail wasn't answering her phone. The whole situation felt increasingly bizarre, and Cody decided it was time to call the police. By the time he made the call, one of his friends had arrived at the apartment complex to help. Together, they searched the area again before the police arrived, but couldn't find them. It seemed like Mikhail had vanished without a trace. The officers arrived shortly after and joined the search. They thoroughly checked the apartment complex, the wooded area behind it, and nearby streets. They also began going door to door, questioning residents in hopes of finding any clues about Mikhail and Noah's whereabouts. Before long, their efforts paid off. One neighbor mentioned seeing a woman who looked like Mikhail running away from the complex toward the road earlier that day. She wasn't screaming or calling for help, and her son wasn't with her. The police decided to follow up on this lead and asked the complex manager for access to the CCTV footage. They reviewed hours of recordings but couldn't find any sign of Mikhail. But then, something completely unexpected caught their attention. Around noon, the same neighbor who claimed to have seen Mikhail was captured on camera carrying 2 large garbage bags out of the building. The police went straight to the dumpster to examine the contents of those bags. When they opened one, they were met with a horrifying sight. Inside was Noah's body, along with some of Mikhail's belongings, including her phone. This discovery immediately changed the course of the investigation. Detectives knew they had to proceed carefully, as Mikhail's whereabouts were still unknown. They suspected the neighbor was directly involved in the crime and decided to search his apartment. But there was a problem. The man lived right next door to Mikhail's apartment, where Cody and other family members were waiting. The 2 apartments shared a wall, and the police were concerned that what they might find inside the neighbor's apartment could trigger an uncontrollable situation. To avoid this scenario, the officers came up with a plan. They asked Cody and his family members to temporarily leave their apartment, explaining that investigators needed to conduct a thorough examination. What they didn't tell Cody was that his son's body had just been discovered only a few dozen yards away. As soon as Cody left, the police went straight to the neighbor's apartment. They requested permission to search the unit, and the man voluntarily agreed. When investigators reached the bathroom, they found Mikhail. Her body was lying in the tub, completely unclothed. After this heartbreaking discovery, the neighbor, 53-year-old Robert Major, was immediately arrested, and detectives now had to piece together what had happened inside that apartment. While waiting for medical examiners to determine the exact causes of death, the police began looking into Robert's background, and what they found was truly shocking. Robert had an extensive criminal record spanning several decades. He had been charged more than 24 times, mostly for sexual offenses. But despite his repeated arrests, Robert had only served short prison sentences. During his time in custody, he was evaluated by multiple psychiatrists, and he openly admitted to them that he really enjoyed committing these acts and took pleasure in his crimes. With multiple expert evaluations on record, authorities knew for sure Robert was likely to reoffend. But instead of keeping him behind bars after his numerous crimes, he was released in 2016. The only measure the police took was to issue a public warning, informing the community about Robert and the threat he posed. Robert was also required to register in a special offender database. He was banned from living near women, children, schools, or playgrounds, prohibited from leaving his city, which was located about 190 miles from Hinton, and ordered to meet with a police representative on a regular basis. But these restrictions quickly became irrelevant. Canadian law basically removed individuals from the registry and lifted their restrictions if they went a year without committing another crime. Because of this, Robert fell off the radar of law enforcement several years before the tragedy. At some point, he moved to Hinton and settled in a residential complex filled with families and children. None of the local police officers were aware of his criminal history. The management of the apartment complex, even if they wanted to, had no way of accessing this information, let alone the residents themselves. Medical experts soon completed their examination of the bodies, while Robert, shortly after his arrest, gave a partial confession and his words shocked even the most seasoned investigators. On top of that, they managed to gather additional evidence and witness statements that helped piece together the full picture of what happened on that fateful day. That morning, Mikhail and Noah went for a walk in the nearby park. When they returned home, the building manager approached Mikhail to discuss an issue. The problem was that Cody, who worked on pipelines, would often come home with his boots and clothes covered in dirt, leaving muddy tracks all the way to their apartment door. The manager asked Mikhail to address the situation, and she promised to clean it up right away. After their conversation, Mikhail went back inside, put Noah down for a nap, and started preparing lunch. Around this time, she also called a friend. This friend later recalled hearing a knock at Mikhail's door during their conversation, followed by a man's voice. He offered to help clean the hallway, but the friend didn't catch the rest of the exchange. Shortly after, Mikhail returned to the kitchen, finished her call, and sent a message to a family member around 2 p.m. From there, one critical question remained unanswered for investigators. How did Mikhail end up in Robert's apartment? Robert himself refused to clarify this particular moment, leaving police to speculate. Perhaps he lured her there under some pretense, maybe by continuing the conversation about cleaning the hallway or asking for her help with something else. One way or another, Mikhail ended up inside Robert's apartment, and this is where his confession began. Almost immediately after she walked through the door, he attacked her and tried to strangle her. But, for nearly 10 minutes, he struggled to succeed. In the end, he managed to kill her and then assay her. He then dragged her body to the bathroom before heading to her apartment, where he took Noah and ended his life as well. After committing these horrific acts, Robert placed Noah's body, along with Mikhail's clothes and belongings, into garbage bags and dumped them in a container outside the building. It seemed he had no further plan, as Mikhail's body was simply left in the bathroom. Although, he tried to mislead investigators by claiming that Mikhail had run off from the complex, possibly hoping that police wouldn't think to look inside his apartment. As for his motives, they remain unclear. The details of the case, including the full account of his confession, were never made fully public. Investigators shared only bits of information with the media, leaving room for speculation. The reason behind Mikhail's murder was relatively straightforward. Not only did Robert find satisfaction in causing harm, but he also killed her with the intent of SA. However, Noah's murder was more perplexing. Investigators suggested that Robert may have killed him out of fear that Noah could identify him. Another theory is that Noah woke up and started crying, which may have scared Robert, thinking the noise could draw attention from the neighbors. One way or another, Robert's main motive became crystal clear through his numerous conversations with psychiatrists. He simply took genuine pleasure in harming others, especially those who were physically weaker than him. It's worth noting that even prison didn't stop him. During one of his previous sentences, Robert assaulted a cellmate, which led to additional charges. With news of this case spreading across the country, many were horrified, not only by the brutality of the crime, but also by the fact that such a dangerous man had been allowed to live freely. Public outrage grew even stronger when details of what happened during the trial came to light, but more on that later. Robert openly admitted to psychiatrists that he enjoyed committing such crimes, and all of them agreed there was a very high likelihood he would do it again. But despite this, he was released back into society, and eventually, authorities stopped monitoring him altogether. The residents of that complex had no way of knowing about his criminal past either. Even if he had remained on a sex offender registry, the system in Canada works very differently than in the US. In Canada, only law enforcement officials can access the registry, not the general public. This left many Canadians outraged as the laws prioritized protecting the privacy of a predator but failed to protect Mikhail and her son. The family had moved into that complex just 15 days before the tragedy, only to become victims of a man who lived literally next door. This devastating injustice pushed Cody and the rest of the family to fight for change. They became actively involved in drafting a new piece of legislation named In Noah's Memory. The main goal of the bill was to ensure that repeat offenders are monitored for their entire lives, not just for a short period after their release. The bill also proposed creating a public registry of these offenders so anyone could easily check if someone with a criminal past was living in their area. As for Robert, he didn't deny his guilt, so the trial moved pretty quickly. But before sentencing, his final statement shocked everyone and once again raised the question of why someone like him was ever released. He openly admitted that he should remain in prison for the rest of his life, because even he would fear what he might do if he were ever free again. At the same time, he claimed he still saw himself as a good person, despite everything he had done. In the end, Robert was sentenced to life in prison, but there was a catch. He would still be eligible for parole in 25 years. If he lives that long, he'll be 78 years old, and there's no guarantee he wouldn't still pose a threat to others, even at that age. As for the bill the victim's family is fighting for, progress has been frustratingly slow. Despite years of advocacy, the legislation still hasn't been passed, and it's unclear if it ever will be. If you like this video, please subscribe